The doors of the Parliament building closed suddenly at 9:47 in the morning. Security officers stood at every entrance. Staff members were asked to hand over their phones before making any calls. Inside the main office of the European Union, the woman who had spent years guiding policies for hundreds of millions of Europeans sat alone behind a closed door, reading a document that could completely change her career and reputation. The document came from the European Court of Justice. It was not a warning, and it was not a suggestion. It was a legal order. Immediate, binding, and serious. The name written on that order was Ursula von der Leyen. For many people across Europe, she had been one of the most powerful political leaders in the region. But now her position and actions were being placed under intense legal and political scrutiny. About 3 weeks earlier, something important had happened inside the European Court of Justice that many media outlets barely discussed. A sealed legal filing had been submitted to the court's emergency review chamber. It was not filed by a single politician or a small group. It came from a coalition of members of the European Parliament representing 11 different EU member states. This was not a routine legal request. It was a formal petition asking the court to review evidence of serious institutional problems inside the European Commission. The members who signed the petition argued that the issues were so serious that an emergency review was necessary. The court accepted the petition within 48 hours. That decision alone caught the attention of many legal experts across Europe. Normally, the court moves slowly and carefully to avoid political pressure. A rapid response usually means the court believes the issue requires urgent examination. Legal analysts quickly realized that the evidence presented in the sealed filing must have been detailed and well documented. According to the petitioners, the information did not rely on rumors or political accusations. They said it included financial records, internal documents, and verified reports that required the court to take a closer look. While this legal process quietly moved forward, public attention remained focused on other news stories, fashion events, sports transfers, and routine political press conferences where Ursula von der Leyen spoke about energy policies and environmental goals. But behind the scenes, a major legal investigation was unfolding. The first part of the evidence presented to the court focused on the LIFE program, the European Union's major environmental funding initiative. This program is designed to support environmental protection projects across Europe, including forest conservation, river restoration, and climate-related infrastructure. Every year, billions of euros from European taxpayers flow through this program. Citizens are told the funding supports environmental protection and sustainable development. However, investigators who examined the financial records of the program over a 14-month period reported irregularities in how some funds were distributed during the leadership period of Ursula von der Leyen. According to the filing, some funds that were originally intended for environmental projects appear to have been redirected toward communication projects, media organizations, and digital platforms. These organizations reportedly produced content supporting certain EU climate policies and communication campaigns. Investigators also examined contracts, payments, and authorization documents. They followed the approval process for multiple projects and tried to identify how decisions were made and who approved them. One of the most sensitive points in the investigation involved an internal compliance report that had been submitted to the European Commission more than a year earlier. A compliance officer reportedly flagged irregularities in spending within the LIFE program. According to the documents referenced in the filing, that report did not lead to a public investigation. The officer who prepared the report was later transferred to a different department, and several individuals involved in the internal review later left their positions. The court's documents describe this sequence of events as concerning because internal oversight systems are meant to identify and address problems before they grow larger. But the filing included more than financial oversight questions. The second part of the investigation focused on decisions made during the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2021, European governments faced enormous pressure to secure vaccines for their populations. Hospitals were struggling, economies were slowing, and political leaders across Europe needed fast solutions. At that time, Ursula von der Leyen announced that she would personally oversee negotiations for a large EU-wide vaccine procurement agreement. According to investigators, the negotiations involved direct communication between Ursula von der Leyen and Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer. The agreement that followed eventually became one of the largest vaccine procurement contracts in European history. However, questions later emerged about how those negotiations were conducted. Some members of the European Parliament requested access to messages and communications related to the negotiations as part of their oversight role. Those requests became a major point of debate because some communications were reportedly conducted through personal devices rather than official government channels. Critics argued that this made it more difficult for oversight bodies to review the full negotiation process. When the European Parliament asked for access to those messages, the response from the Commission stated that certain communications could not be retrieved. That response sparked further political debate across Europe about transparency, government communication rules, and how large public contracts should be negotiated and documented. And that debate eventually became one of the central issues examined in the court filing that triggered the emergency review. The reply that shocked many investigators was simple: the messages no longer existed. They had been deleted. When the court examined that answer, it also looked at the enormous contract that had resulted from those communications. It looked at the financial terms that, according to critics, have still not been fully explained to the public. After reviewing those details, the court reached conclusions that created serious political consequences. Even some of the strongest supporters of Ursula von der Leyen inside the European Commission reportedly chose not to comment publicly. But the most serious issue came from what investigators described as a third layer of evidence. This part of the ruling used unusually strong language for a legal document. According to observers, this was the reason the atmosphere inside the Commission suddenly became tense after the decision was announced. Reports also suggested that several senior officials began seeking legal advice shortly afterward. The key question raised by investigators was simple but important: what exactly had been discussed in the deleted messages, and who else might have been aware of those discussions? According to the court's analysis, the third part of the investigation expanded the focus beyond a single political controversy. Investigators examined earlier decisions made during the time when Ursula von der Leyen served as Germany's Minister of Defense. Their goal was to understand whether patterns of decision-making from that period also appeared later during her leadership in Brussels. During her time as defense minister, Germany launched a major modernization effort within its military administration. As part of that process, large consulting firms were hired to provide advice on restructuring, planning, and management. Public records showed that more than €200 million were paid to consulting companies within a single fiscal year. Several major firms were involved, including McKinsey Company, Accenture, and Booz Allen Hamilton. Each of these firms received contracts worth millions of euros to support various reform projects connected to Germany's defense system. At the time, these contracts were widely presented as part of an effort to modernize the German military and improve efficiency. Many reports described the initiative as an attempt to bring private sector expertise into government administration. However, investigators later reviewed the procurement process behind these contracts. They examined records, contract files, and financial transactions connected to the agreements. According to the findings referenced in the court documents, investigators reported that important documentation was missing in several cases. Public procurement rules normally require a transparent tender process when large government contracts are awarded. In many of the contracts examined, investigators said the supporting records that normally explain how a company was selected could not be located. In some cases, files were described as incomplete. In other cases, documentation that should have existed was reportedly unavailable. The court's ruling stated that such large-scale gaps in documentation raised serious questions. Judges noted that when documentation is missing across multiple transactions, investigators must consider whether the issue resulted from administrative mistakes or from deeper structural problems within the system. The investigation also revisited concerns that had been raised earlier during a parliamentary inquiry in Germany. That inquiry had examined some of the same consulting contracts several years earlier. During that process, questions were raised about whether certain companies had connections to individuals within political or professional networks associated with Ursula von der Leyen. Those connections did not automatically indicate wrongdoing, but investigators considered them relevant when reviewing procurement decisions. The court's ruling did not directly accuse anyone of bribery or illegal payments. Instead, it described a pattern in the way certain contracts were awarded and documented. The word pattern appeared multiple times in the section discussing consulting agreements. According to the ruling, investigators observed recurring elements: similar companies receiving contracts, similar documentation gaps appearing in records, and similar procurement procedures being questioned. The investigation also looked at later financial decisions made during the period when Ursula von der Leyen led the European Commission. Analysts compared consulting contracts issued by the Commission between 2019 and 2023 with companies that had previously worked with the German Defense Ministry. They found that some of the same consulting firms continued to receive contracts at the European level. Investigators examined whether these overlaps could be explained simply by the fact that large institutions often work repeatedly with major consulting firms. However, the court stated that the overlaps appeared in areas where financial documentation also raised questions, which is why investigators decided to review them more closely. The ruling emphasized that the issue was not necessarily one isolated decision. Instead, investigators were examining whether repeated administrative practices created weaknesses in transparency and oversight. For several years, journalists, parliamentary committees, and legal experts had already discussed similar concerns. Reports were published, debates took place, and formal complaints were submitted. Many of these issues, however, did not immediately result in major legal action. According to the court documents, the final part of the investigation examined whether internal systems within European institutions had properly addressed these concerns. Investigators reviewed the role of administrative staff, legal advisors, and communication teams involved in financial and procurement decisions. Their goal was to determine whether internal review procedures had been followed correctly. The public version of the court ruling does not list every individual involved in those internal processes. Legal sources have indicated that additional details were placed in a sealed annex attached to the ruling. According to those sources, the annex reportedly contains names, job titles, and specific findings related to individuals who were involved in administrative procedures connected to the investigated contracts. Because those names remain confidential, the public document focuses mainly on institutional responsibilities rather than personal accusations. Nevertheless, legal observers in Brussels reported that several officials began consulting legal advisors shortly after the ruling became public. This was not necessarily because charges had been filed, but because the existence of the sealed annex suggested that further legal examination could follow depending on future investigations. For many observers, the ruling raised broader questions about transparency, procurement rules, and accountability within large international institutions. And those questions are likely to remain part of the political conversation in Europe for some time.